Thank you for inviting me. So I am a little bit ADHD. I can't stand still. So I'm going to walk up and down in front of here. I hope that's okay. Um, so today what I'm going to do is talk about a neuroscience research program that I'm currently working on that explores a phenomena we call dehumanized perception. Now, dehumanized perception is both a psychological phenomena as well as a neuroscientific phenomena. So we will try our best to illustrate this. I'm also going to be talking about a mechanism that occurs, I think, right before violence takes place. So I'm not talking about how ideology affects the brain. I'm not talking about group processes. I'm talking about what happens in the brain of someone right before they pull the trigger. And so we'll see if we can learn something from that point of view. Um, I always like to begin, I think, by telling you who I am and the type of scientific approach I take. So I'm a social neuroscientist. That has many different meanings. But when I use the term, I'm talking about using neuroscience to address social behavior research questions, and more specifically using the tools of neuroscience. So all of my questions tend to be social psychological in nature because that's my primary discipline. Specifically, I look at when social cognition is engaged and when is it withheld from other people. And so that allows me to study a range of topics like dehumanization, anthropomorphism, stuff up there that I won't talk about. But more specifically, in keeping with the interdisciplinary nature of this conference, and indeed the interdisciplinary nature of neuroscience, I am going to use philosophical, economics, psychology, lots of different theoretical perspectives to try to make sense of what's happening in the brain. Okay, so very brief overview. I'll first recap everything that was said this morning, all the talk about psychology and Milgram and Arendt, and we'll do that stuff again. Then I'll tell you about some of our evidence for dehumanized perception, which is a spontaneous phenomena, not automatic, not unaware. It's just spontaneous. It happens readily, right? And we can discuss what that means. Um, then I'll talk to you about more conscious evaluations of humanness and what those tend to look like in the brain. So when we ask people what is human, what do you consider human, how the brain sort of solves that problem. Okay, so as we've discussed all morning, people tend to describe evil behavior in acts of massacre and genocide. They use the term to characterize what we've seen, but this is a relatively recent occurrence. For the longest time, evil resided solely in the domain of the supernatural. So people were possessed by evil spirits, which caused them to do different things. One of the first philosophers to sort of get rid of this supernatural view of evil was Immanuel Kant, who sort of placed evil at the feet of every human being and said, we are all capable of performing evil behavior. Kant's writings, of course, inspired Arendt, who we heard a lot about today. I'm not going to get into details. We sort of will just be rehashing the morning session. But essentially, she demonstrated that it seems that ordinary people can be driven to do evil things. And this is a theme that really resonated with social psychology, which is the study of the social context and behavior. And so again, Milgram's famous experiments demonstrated that ordinary people could do horrible things. There are also these Good Samaritan experiments, which no one has described. Essentially, researchers documented that even theology students who are thinking about the Good Samaritan parable will fail to stop and help someone in need if they're in a rush. And so even people that have self-selected to be morally good and who are thinking about the concept of helping will often ignore opportunities at helping. And there's a series of wonderful social psychological studies by John Darley and colleagues. And then, of course, the Stanford Prison Experiment, which again, I'm not going to get into. And so the theme of all of these approaches is that there's something in everyone that can be brought out by a particular social context that can then drive evil behavior. Now, in psychology, a lot of the early researchers were actually European Jews who fled Nazi Germany to the US, people described previously like Henry Tajfeld. And they studied topics, of course, related to what was happening in Europe. And one of the topics they studied was dehumanization as an explanatory mechanism for the things that had been going on. So there's lots of social psychological theory about dehumanization, right? Gordon Allport talks about the loss of power to think about outgroups as individuals. Irv talks about people who operate beyond moral rules and values get dehumanized. Irv Bartal talked about acts beyond societal norms can lead to this exclusion. Um, and outgroups essentially are viewed as having a lesser degree of humanity. Now, recently, Nick Haslam has sort of dissociated dehumanization into sort of typically dehumanization, denying typical human traits, which equates you to the level of automata or machines, and then denying uniquely human traits, which elevates us above the level of animals. And so you can dehumanize people to machines or to animals. But the point is, there's lots of social psychological theory. Only about 10 years ago or so have we started doing actual social psychology experiments in dehumanization. Oh, no, sorry. So to drive home the point, you reduce somebody to something less than human. So 10 or 12 years ago, we started doing actual experiments. The first set of experiments were in something that was called infrahumanization. And if you ask Jacques-Philippe Liens, the researcher who did a lot of these studies, he said that he wanted to call it dehumanization, but the sort of political context of the word was too much. Reviewers were like, you can't study such a thing empirically, so he sort of picked up this less noxious term. In any case, he was able to demonstrate that people in the in-group do not perceive the out-group as experiencing human or social emotions to the same extent as they do. So regardless of valence, my out-group member might feel sadness if I kill their friend, but they may never feel remorse at their actions. Remorse being this more complicated social emotion. And by social emotion, I mean an emotion that can only be felt in the actual, imagined, or implied presence of other people. And so anyone can feel sorry. I can feel sorry if, I lost my ice cream cone. But I will only feel regret when considering other people. And so Jacques-Philippe's theory was that we can quite easily measure this, and he indeed found evidence for this at a group level. This has also been found in specific groups, not looking at infrahumanization, but other types of dehumanization. So Phil Goff and Jennifer Eberhardt and colleagues have done studies in America looking at dehumanization of African Americans. And what they've found is that if they prime people with crime primes, as they call them, so things like a gun, you're more likely to pick out a black face from a snowy screen as the snow gradually clears than you are to pick out a white face, for instance. They've also found that A prime, so again, the historical dehumanization in that context is likening black people to apes. And so if you prime someone with ape, they were again more likely to see black faces coming out of these snowy screens, right? So this is a very perceptual phenomena. It's not based on your ideology or on your theories. It's just based on the historical associations between these groups. They even have a study, which I didn't put up here, which shows that the extent to which media depicts trials involving black people using animalistic terms, so things like concrete jungle, the more likely those people get sentenced to death, right? And this was a study they did looking at cases in the Philadelphia district. So all of this research suggests that dehumanization isn't just theoretical. It might actually be going on out there. So now the question is, what brain processes might underlie dehumanization? And to answer that question, we will first ask, what might human perception look like in the brain? Now, this is a very hard puzzle to solve. And so to gain some traction, let's turn to the philosophers. So in philosophy of mind, there's a very popular thought experiment, right? Which is going to help us answer, how does the brain dissociate human from non-human agents? And the experiment goes something like this. Imagine one day you came home and your significant other, your spouse, your roommate, whoever, was unbeknownst to you replaced by a robot. Now, given the current state of technological advancement, this may not be too far in the future. So you get home one day and there's an imposter. How would you be able to tell the difference if this robot looked and acted exactly in the same way as your significant other did? Now, most people, when they get asked this question, simply say something like, they won't have the same memories, they won't sort of have the same personality, they may behave in the same ways, but there may be little differences in the things they say towards me because, well, I'm important to them. In essence, most people tend to talk about the mental life of someone else. And so one way we might dissociate humans from non-humans is by saying that human beings are those who trigger in us thoughts about their mental life. So if I'm encountering someone else, I'm automatically, or rather, I won't use that word, I'm spontaneously thinking about what's going on inside of their heads, right? What does their mental life look like? And now with that comes, I think, application of moral rules and norms. So for instance, this cartoon says at the critical move, the supercomputer went blank, right? And it's because the guy is unplugging the computer. This is funny, right? But if he were playing against his friend and instead of unplugging his friend, he sort of hit him over the head, it might be less funny. So there are rules dictating how we interact with people versus things that aren't people, right? And those are moral and social rules, right? Moral and social norms. Now, where in the brain is responsible for this? Well, if you're thinking about somebody else's mind, you're engaging in what I call social cognition. In neuroscience, there are a million terms for this phenomena. Some people call it theory of mind, some people call it empathy. I prefer the use of the term social cognition, which means thinking about the thoughts, feelings, mental life of someone else. Now, over the last 10 years or so, we've realized that there seems to be a reliable network that becomes engaged when people engage social cognitive processing. This includes areas of medial prefrontal cortex, right? So extending from areas that I might consider ACC all the way oftentimes to orbital frontal cortex, but also areas of temporal lobe, starting at the temporal parietal junction, extending along the temporal sulcus. This is where the FFA is, for instance, which also together constitute part of the social cognition brain network. Now, depending on the task, you're going to get other regions. So and other researchers have done studies where we've seen parietal lobe involvement, sort of precuneus involvement as well, and you can often get subcortical involvement. These aren't social brain regions, but when they activate together in concert, it suggests that social cognition is occurring. Initially, we tended to focus just on medial prefrontal cortex, right, the MPFC area, and so a lot of our early studies focused on this brain region, but today we sort of think more broadly in terms of this network, and we get effects all over the network. Now, if it is indeed the case that human beings engage this additional processing when we encounter them, we should see evidence of this in the literature. And so in one study we did recently, we went to the literature and we looked at neuroeconomic games. What are neuroeconomic games? These are games people play while in the scanner that involve some type of economic exchanges. So things like the ultimatum game, the trust game, the dictator game, where you're strategizing against somebody else, right? Strategic interaction decisions. Now, in lots of these studies, experimenters will use computers as control. So they will say, you're now playing the game, the same trust game you just played where you're exchanging sums of money, but instead of another person, it's against a computer algorithm. And what you find across those studies is that you get this additional processing when you're doing it with people. So you don't need these regions necessarily to solve the decision-making task, but you bring them online when it's a social context. You bring them online when you're interacting with another human being. So here are some of the parietal regions, the MPFC. And we also show that you even get additional engagement in some of these learning and reward regions, which tend to underlie these tasks traditionally. And so the idea is very simply that there's this additional processing we bring to bear when we encounter other human beings. It's called social cognition, and it happens spontaneously. Okay, so what's dehumanized perception? I guess by now you can figure out what dehumanized perception is. So it's essentially what I call fungible social cognition, right? It's based on the idea that when we encounter another human being, we don't have to engage those processes, right? When we encounter another human being, we do not have to engage these processes. And what we've done is try to find evidence for this. So social cognition can be withheld from people, and very soon I'll show you what that looks like and in what context. And we thought that social context and people's goals may reduce social cognition. And cases of genocide, we sort of hypothesized the same thing. And then also in cases of slavery, which hasn't been talked about here today, another case of human atrocity where essentially I think you see the same types of processes. So the idea is simply that social cognition gets in the way. You have a goal, your goal is exterminating these people. If you thought about how much the people would suffer, that would slow you down, get in the way of you achieving that goal, and so you regulate that ability. And so we think that social cognition can trigger emotional processes that prohibit goal congruent behavior. And of course, the goals can come from anywhere, right? I'm agnostic about where they come from. I'm simply trying to describe the process that might be occurring. So to study this phenomena, we first started with extremely stigmatized outgroups. These were homeless people and drug addicts. And we relied on a model in social psychology that talked about person perception, right? How do we see other people? This model says there are two dimensions of person perception, right? Two things we care about when we encounter other people. One is their perceived warmth, so how threatening or not is this person. The other is their competence, which describes their ability to instantiate these threats. Well, in this model, it sort of solves to a 2 by 2 space where you can divide groups along the 4 different high-low quadrants. So for instance, all in-groups tend to elicit high appraisals of warmth, so they're very nice, but they're also very competent. And out-groups go into these remaining 3 quadrants, right? So out-groups that are seen as very nice, but not very competent, receive the emotion pity. And these are groups in US samples like elderly people or disabled people. Out-groups that are viewed as very competent but not very nice receive the ambivalent emotion envy. These are groups like business people, rich people in American samples. And then finally, groups that are seen as extreme out-groups that are perceived as low on both trait dimensions elicit the non-social emotion disgust. Um, and these were groups like homeless people and drug addicts. And so what we did in these very early studies was very simple, right? These are groups perceived as not nice and inept. They elicit disgust and contempt. We thought we'd simply show people pictures of these groups while in the scanner. So first, here's the ratings, right? People agree with our a priori emotional descriptions, right? They say that these groups make them feel these particular emotions, so they're above chance. And when you look in the brain again, in this early study, we cared about MPFC. You saw MPFC engagement in each of the other, towards the other 3 types of groups, but not towards our dehumanized groups. We wanted to sort of verify this wasn't just some quirk of brain imaging. So we tried it using another method with EEG. We also got a dissociation. But what EEG also showed us was how quickly this happened. So already at 240 milliseconds, right? So the stimulus comes on here. These are 10 millisecond time bins. Already at 240, you're seeing differences between the extreme out groups, which are dehumanized, and everybody else. So very quickly on, the brain is sort of dissociating these 2 types of groups, and we think this reflects differential engagement of social cognition. We wanted behavioral evidence for this, so we did another study where we showed you pictures of dehumanized groups, and we simply said, describe a day in their life. And here we coded for the kinds of verbs that people were using. In psychology, there's a description of verbs and adjectives from most abstract to most concrete, with adjectives being the most abstract, and these varying in their level of concreteness. So most concrete is descriptive action verbs. If I say he's sitting, that's a basic action. If I say he's sprawled on the floor, I'm interpreting the basic action. Or I can say he's relaxing on the floor, right? Which is using a description of his mental life, his mental state to describe the behavior. So he's gaining satisfaction from performing the basic behavior. So we wanted to see were people using differential amounts of these words, right? These are mental state verbs, verbs you can only use if you're thinking about the mental life. And I wouldn't tell you about it if it wasn't true. Here are the different groups, and you can see those that were dehumanized elicited a lot less spontaneous mental state verb use. And so now we feel like we have some behavioral evidence for it. So we replicated our study quite a number of times because it was often very difficult for us to believe, and so we wanted to make sure it was true. But then we noticed in the literature other people were getting similar results. So here's what the brain looks like, for instance, right before you shoot somebody in a violent first-person shooter game, right? So this is right before you pull the trigger. You get this massive deactivation, primarily in areas involved in social cognition like MPFC and temporal regions. If you're a very sexist man and you're looking at a scantily clad woman, this is what your brain looks like. Again, sort of reproducing the effect where MPFC, precuneus, temporal regions are less active because you're sort of objectifying the woman, presumably. And so we've seen this effect in a number of different contexts, which suggests it's not unique to homeless people, but it may be something that's representative of a more general effect. And so we decided to, so I'm going to show you just a little bit of data today from our labor market context because it makes a nice point showing that anyone can dehumanize and anybody else can be dehumanized. You don't have to be a special kind of person or belong to a relevant group. So in this study, what we did very simply is we created a fantasy league. So we brought participants into the lab, gave them a meaningless task where they guessed time. That varies, so some people are great at guessing time, other people like me are terrible at it, so you get natural variability. We brought a new group of participants in, gave them some money, and told them their job was to buy 5 people from our first wave to create a team who would then compete on your behalf later in the scatter. And so participants went ahead and bought 5 people. It didn't matter if they bought good people or bad people. And then in the scanner, we simply showed them pictures of the people they had purchased versus pictures of people they hadn't purchased. And that's what the brain does, right? You get this dehumanization effect for the people that you purchase. Now, this is an epiphenomenal. We thought this has to be functional in some way. So we wanted to see, could this predict anything meaningful in our task? And indeed it did. We found a lovely dissociation where for people that you purchase, this social cognition brain activity reduction predicted the value you would later assign to them. So the last part of our task says, now tell us how much this person is worth to you. So your ability to assign value requires dehumanization, but not when you didn't buy the guy, right? There's no correlation here. What determined value for non-purchase players was the same thing that did for everything else, sort of traditional valuation regions like orbital frontal cortex. But this region wasn't determining value for our purchase players. So in some sense, dehumanization might be necessary in this context in order to allow you to correctly assign value. So what I'm going to do now with whatever time I have left is sort of switch gears from this very spontaneous process to talk about more conscious evaluations of humanness. And so as has been pointed out here, and as philosophers told me a long time ago, people are aware that the dehumanized person is still a person, right? They still have a face, they still have a human form. So how can they sort of be at peace with this cognitive dissonance, I guess, right? Between viewing them as not human, but at the same time recognizing that they are. And so I'll just show you a very brief pieces of data. In one study, we did the obvious. We sort of showed you pictures of people, not just dehumanized people, but everybody. And we just asked you to rate them on how typically human. And then we asked the question, what part of the brain co-varies with these ratings? And instead of finding social cognition network or anything like that, we got a little area of anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. Why the ACC? This is often involved in conflict resolution, right? So when there's a conflict in a decisional choice task, for instance, sometimes ACC will highlight this conflict. So this suggests that people on some level are aware. In another task, we did valuing life. So we told you, here's a trolley dilemma. There's a runaway trolley. It's about to kill these 5 people, and we showed you who the 5 people were. You have an opportunity to save these 5 people by pushing this guy. Right? So you're saving 5 dehumanized people by pushing a humanized guy. We did lots of variations on this. So you push dehumanized people to save humanized people. Essentially, you get moral acceptability ratings vary, as you might suspect. That's less interesting. But what is interesting is the brain activation. So when you're sacrificing the dehumanized to save regular people, again, the brain is sort of engaging. Here's the ACC region again. It's getting other things involved, which I won't talk about, but it's also relying on this ACC. Again, signaling some type of conscious awareness or conflict. And these are the many wonderful people who has done the work. So I'm not